This morning, if you've not been here with us the last few weeks, we have been preaching through the book of Esther, and if you'll take your copy of God's Word and join me at Esther chapter number 5, we'll continue on in this expository teaching. We've been the first several chapters. In the last chapter, of course, you are very familiar with most of this history of the book of Esther, where Haman and Mordecai have a conflict, and Haman goes to the king and seeks the destruction. It's a extermination of all the Jews throughout the land of Persia, and that is, of course, granted. And Mordecai discovers that plot and sends word to Queen Esther. And Esther in chapter 4 has resolved to enter into the king's presence. And of course she knows that this is against the custom. It carries a likely death sentence. And so to do so, to enter into the king's presence, she must trust in the providence of God. Now we have a conflict here between Haman and Esther. Esther has determined to go into the king's presence, but Haman is already in the king's presence. Haman is already in the presence of King Ahasuerus, and he is comfortable and he is conceited in the king's presence. And while she seeks to overturn this evil plan of extermination, Haman wants to continue his evil plot. Haman is relying on his position, but Esther must rely on God's providence. And so chapter 5 is a contrast. Chapter 5 is a character contrast. And so let's read through chapter number 5, Esther 5. Notice with me, the author here says, "Now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house over against the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house over against the gate of the house. And it was so, when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. Then said the king unto her, What wilt thou, Queen Esther, and what is thy request? It shall be even given thee to the half of the kingdom. And Esther answered, If it seem good unto the king, let the king and Haman come this day unto the banquet that I have prepared for him. Then the king said, Cause Haman to make haste, that he may do as Esther has said. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And the king said to Esther, At the banquet of wine, what is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? Even to the half of the kingdom it shall be performed. Then answered Esther and said, My petition, my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition and perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king hath said. Then went Haman forth that day, joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman refrained himself, and when he came home, he sent and called for his friends and Zeresh his wife, and Haman told them of the glory of his riches and the multitude of his children, and all the things wherein the king had promoted him, and how he advanced him above all the princes and servants of the king. Haman said, Moreover, Yea, Esther the queen did let no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she had prepared but myself. And tomorrow I am invited unto her also with the king. Yet all this availeth me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then said Zeresh his wife and all his friends unto him, Let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high, and tomorrow speak thou unto the king, that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go thou in merrily with the king unto the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the day. We thank you for the reading of your word and the preservation of your word. Lord, we thank you that we have your word to look into, that we may find wisdom, that we may find guidance. We thank you that, Lord, you have given us teachers to explain your word to us. Lord, we pray today that you would use your word to guide our lives, and that you would use your Spirit to open our hearts and minds to receive your instruction. Lord, that you would send us forth from this place a better people, more able to live holy and separated, sanctified lives, Lord, that we may be better able to share your gospel, Lord, better able to live for you. In Jesus' name, amen. As we look into Esther chapter 5, we see two primary characters, two characters that we've been introduced to before, two characters which will not completely reintroduce to you, characters which are not perfect by any means, characters that we know God is in control of, and God controls both the actions and the reactions of these players in the course of human history. He uses his providence to fulfill his promises. Now, there are important lessons for us to draw from the posture that is assumed by the primary characters in this chapter. These two persons, Esther the queen and Haman, who is the prime minister, are examples of the contrast that we see between meekness and malice. And that's my sermon title this morning, Meekness and Malice. I'm sure that at some point in your life, we have had occasion to display both of these qualities, the qualities of meekness and the qualities of malice. But the question for us is, which one is dominant? Which one is preeminent? Which one has the pinnacle of our life? Do we come before the king in meekness, or do we harbor bitterness? And do we come before the king seeking to manipulate the king to fulfill our own malice? We have in the first half of the chapter, verses 1 through 8, an example of meekness in the quivering queen. Notice that she's nervous. She comes before the king in a position that, as we mentioned very briefly last week, she's called for a fast. She's called for the nation, the Jewish people that are in exile in Persia. She's called for them to fast with her. And in all portions of the empire of Persia, there is wailing and weeping and fasting amongst the Jews. And she says that her and her maidens will fast also. What does this do to the body? It doesn't make it pretty. And so she knows that she is going before the king, not looking pretty, not looking her best. She's going before the king, relying upon not her physical beauty to be attractive. Notice, first of all, her daring in verse number 1. She puts on the royal apparel and she stands in the inner court of the king's house. Where does she live? If you recall the extensive discussion that we had in the second and third and fourth chapters of how these young ladies were treated, they were brought into the first house of the women. They were prepared and pampered and primped for a year. They spent a night with the king, and then they were sent to the second house of the women. They didn't come to the king's house but one night. And she has now come to the king's house. In chapter 4, Esther's resignation has now led her to take action in chapter 5. And she has put on her royal apparel, and she has come to the king's house. You see, she doesn't merely rest upon the sovereignty of God and ignore human responsibility. Esther takes every act in her own power to ensure success. You see, in chapter 4, a fast has been proclaimed at Esther's request. There is mourning, there is weeping, there is wailing. In verse number 1, she has dressed in the best clothing that she has in order to approach the king. The royal robes have been pulled out of storage. She has been She has dressed herself in the royal robes. Esther has come to the king. She has approached unto Xerxes. She has brought herself to the only person in the entire empire. She has approached the sovereign of the Persian Empire, who is the only one with ability to help. All of these things, notice, have happened after she has had all of the Jews appeal to God. So she's not ignoring the sovereignty of God, but neither is she ignoring human responsibility. She's daring here. Understand that this is a broken regulation. Chapter number 5, verse 1. She puts on her royal apparel and she stands in the inner court of the king's house. That is a violation of the rule that we are revealed in chapter 4, verse 11, that all of the king's servant and the people of the provinces know that whether man or woman comes into the king in the inner court who is not called, there is one law but to put him to death, unless the king holds out his scepter. Understand the irony here. Vashti was banished for not appearing before the king when she was bidden. And this was a made-up law. Remember in chapter 1, the king calls for Vashti and bids her to come, and she refuses. And so he immediately calls these 7 sleazy scumbags, as we've named them, and says, go search the record books and find the law that we can banish her. She didn't break the law, but she was banished. And now Esther, with an actual law, is under the threat of death for showing herself before the king when she is not called. You see the daring here. But in verse 2, we see her deference. It was so when the king saw Esther standing in the court, she obtained favor in his sight. The king holds out to Esther the golden scepter in his hand. So Esther drew near, and she touches the top of the scepter. The king has observed Esther, now present in his court. By the way, she stands in the court guilty. There is no reason to have a trial. You are in the court of the king. You are unsummoned. You are guilty. Her action here is a breach of a known commandment. Esther's immediate outcome now lies in the hands of this volatile and unpredictable king, Ahasuerus. And we've studied his personality. We've said that previously. As providence would dictate, Xerxes doesn't want to risk the disfavor of yet another scandal in the royal household. His queen has appeared, but not just appeared. The queen has appeared in her royal capacity. She did put on the royal robes, right? She has done everything she can do, and she has put on her royal robes, and you would assume the royal crown as well, and she has taken all of the actions that she can possibly take. And so he holds out the golden scepter to her. And again, you notice here that Esther has taken an immediate action. Once the scepter is held out, she approaches the king and she touches the top of the scepter. And I looked up the significance of that. One of the commentaries says this was the usual way of acknowledging a royal condescension. In other words, he accepts that she may now come in to the king. But it is at the same time expressing a reverence and a submission to the august majesty of the king. In other words, he has offered her favor, and she has accepted the favor of the king. And by touching the top of the scepter, she has ensured the king that she has accepted his favor, and she has also ensured her loyalty. King Ahasuerus understands that Esther has taken a great risk to approach his court. And so there must certainly be some petition. There must be some reason why the queen would risk her life to come before him. There must be some significantly important matter which needs his personal attention. Therefore, in verse 3, he assures the queen that he is willing to solve any distress under which she has been restrained. Half the kingdom. And so, Esther's daring and her deference leads us to dinner in verse 4 and 5. A dinner party. We see the request here, verses 4 and 5. She lays out the request, and Esther simply answers, if it's good, king, if it seems good to you, let's have yet another banquet. Let's have yet another party. And I've said you can trace the parties in this book. There's so many banquets. There's so many parties. Every occurrence in this book that you read, every time something happens, the immediate reaction is either pass a law or throw a party. Sometimes it's both. So Esther asks the king to come to the banquet. And by the way, since you're coming, bring this Prime Minister Haman along. He seems to be in such favor inside and outside, right? He seems to be in such favor, so bring along your new Prime Minister. Oh, by the way, come today. Come today. It's verse 4, already prepared. Come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him. By the way, while we're here, let me point out that this is also past tense. I have prepared. It's what we call past perfect tense. Already done. It's already completed. And so here we have another evidence of Queen Esther's action. It's that she's already done. She's already done every action humanly possible. Not passive. Now understand, this does not subvert the sovereignty of God. It's just human responsibility working in conjunction with the sovereignty of God. She has already prepared the banquet, already in full expectation that Xerxes is going to respond positively and going to attend. He's going to agree. And by the way, if his initial response is, I'm not inclined to offer her pardon, her servants can say, well, she's just asking a dinner. Go look. It's already on the table. The banquet's ready. This is a smart lady, right? We see the request in verses 4 and 5. We see, of course, then the response of the king. Typical Xerxes, Ahasuerus style. He gives his quick answer. And I love this answer. Make haste. She says, let the king and Haman come this day. In verse 5, the king says, cause Haman to make haste, that he may do as Esther has said. I mean, get Haman on the move. We're coming. The queen wants to make dinner. We're coming to dinner. Get Haman on the move. Oh, I'm just going to point out a few ironies here. So as a side note, here we have another one of those ironic broken laws. Have you noticed that it's okay for the king to pass any kind of law ex post facto when he wants to try to make up a law to banish the queen? Go make up a law so we can get rid of the queen. But now we've passed this law. Well, I don't like that law, so I'm not going to follow it. Here's another case. Chapter 5, verse 5 is a violation of the law that he passed in chapter 1, verse 22. Remember that we read, every man should bear rule in his own house? And now the queen says, I want you to come to dinner. Okay, we'll come. Bring Haman. Okay, he's coming too. What happened to every man should bear rule in his own house? That was the law in Persia. So they go to dinner. And the king asks, what's your petition? What is it you wanted? Why are we here? We call this the repeat. Esther doesn't really disclose why she asked for the audience before the king. She just repeats the request for another dinner tomorrow. And in true Xerxes style, Another party? We can't refuse. There's another banquet tomorrow? Well, of course I'll come. This actually is our next heading. So, we've looked at her daring and her deference, and now we've looked at her dinners, so let's look at her disguise. Verses 6 through 8. The king asks at the banquet of wine, "What's your petition?" She says, "Well, my request is this. If I've found favor, come to dinner tomorrow night, and I'll tell you all about it then." And understand that Esther is not being weak here. She's actually being very clever. Again, I want to stress that the queen is doing everything that is humanly possible. Here is an example of human action, human responsibility, working alongside of God's sovereignty, and she's trying to ensure that Xerxes will grant her request when she finally reveals it to him. It's kind of like in folk stories when you how many folk stories have you heard? I'll grant you 3 wishes. But the one thing you can't wish for is more wishes. You've heard those kinds of stories. Well, what you could wish for is, I really want you to grant my next wish. Wish number 1 is, the next one is really important. So make double sure you grant the next one. That's kind of what Esther's doing here. Okay? That's really in essence what Esther's doing. You see, Xerxes knows that she didn't come into the presence of the king risking her life just to try to get a date for dinner. Okay? She doesn't risk her life just to invite him to come eat supper with her. So what he does is he ensures her he's positively determined to grant whatever her desire is. So when she risks her life to come before the king, he holds out his golden scepter. She touches the top of her scepter. That is deference to whatever your will is, whatever your majesty wants, I'm willing to do. Okay? And he says, I'm willing to grant your request, whatever it is, to half the kingdom. Come to dinner tonight. What did he just do? He says, I'm going to grant your request. Her request has come to dinner. When he shows up to dinner, that's just promising to grant her request again, right? So Esther says, my wish is that you come to dinner, and I'm going to talk to you then. Okay, so it's discussion over dinner. So Xerxes accepts. That's granting wish number 2 and ensuring that the discussion is going to grant whatever wish she reveals to him. So during dinner, the king says, I'm here promising to deliver your request. That's why I came. So whatever your request is, just as soon as you tell it to me, just as soon as you reveal it to me, I'm going to grant it. That's the second time he's made that promise. And so what does she do? Well, I'm a little timid. I mean, look at verse 7. Between verse 7 and verse 8, it's almost like she starts to tell him and then backs out. And we see this in verse 8. Trust me, that's God working right there. And so she says, well, come back tomorrow night. Let's do this again tomorrow, and I'll tell you everything. So when Xerxes shows up to dinner tomorrow night, what is that? That's promise number 3 that he's made to the queen. So Esther's response, directed by the Lord's sovereign intervention, you've promised to grant my petition, come to the next banquet. Xerxes has now put himself in a predicament, hasn't he? He's promised to grant the request twice, so now if he comes, which he has to come because he's promised to grant the request twice, so I'll be here tomorrow night. When he shows up tomorrow night, his mere attendance is the third promise to the queen that whatever she says, she's going to get. He's made a promise that he can't back out of. He's promised her 3 times, up to half the kingdom, whatever you want, you're going to get. I've told you so 3 times. And when he shows up, he can't back out of this promise. And he doesn't even know what he's promised yet. This girl's smart. He's made 3 promises to grant her wish. And by the way, that's next week. That's the hook for next week. We'll talk about that. can't refuse. Do you know why he can't refuse? Because all of his servants that heard her come, all of his servants in the king's court that saw her come in and put her hand on top of the scepter and say, come to dinner, heard him say, I'll give you half of my kingdom. I'll grant you anything you want. They have seen this go on. She's now had banquet twice. All of her servants that are serving the meal and bringing the dinner have heard this now at least twice. Whatever you want, up to half the kingdom, I'll give it to you. Just tell me what's going on. What is so important that you risk your life and you need the king to intervene? He's made this promise 3 times. He can't not grant her wish without being publicly humiliated. He can't back out of it no matter what it is without the entire king's household, all of his servants, understanding that this man's word is nothing even to his wife. Back up to chapter 1. Remember that event? Remember the whole dealing with Vashti? He's hooked. He can't refuse now. He does know that Esther has been submissive throughout the entire process, from appearing before the king, to touching the top of the scepter, to requesting his petition. She's never once been demanding. She's never once been demeaning. She's always been deferring to whatever his request was. If you're a fisherman, this is what we call hooked, and hooked deep. This fish ain't throwing this hook. But it is the Lord that has used these events. You see, the actions of these human mediators have worked alongside of God's sovereignty. They've worked alongside of divine intervention, and this is what has set in motion the ultimate deliverance of God's people. That's how providence works. You see, miracles aren't needed here. The providence of God overrules the plans of man, and that's how God keeps his promises to his people. He uses his providence. I'm not saying we don't see miracles. You know what I'm saying? God's providence is the miracle. And now we shift gears in verse number 9. We shift gears from this quivering queen to this haughty Haman. In verse 9, we leave the scene of Esther and we begin to contrast the meekness of Esther with the meanness of Haman. And these two people couldn't be more different. Verse number 9, this is right after the banquet. Haman went forth that day, joyful, with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. Verse 9, I call reversed. Haman was reversed. See, happy, happy, happy. This fellow thinks he's on top of the mountain, and he is. He has the world by the tail. He has the bull by the horn. But the problem is, vengeance runs deep. And his vengeance wants paid. His vengeance wants paid promptly. His vengeance wants paid publicly. Go back to chapter 3. Chapter 3, verse number 5. When Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath. And in chapter 5, verse number 9, Haman went forth that day, but when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up. See, he used to get mad just because he didn't bow. Now he's getting mad just because he doesn't stand up. Used to make him full of wrath. Sent him on a mission to exterminate the Jews. And now in chapter 5, Mordecai won't even stand up. He won't even move out of the way. And Haman is full of indignation. You see what's happened here? Haman is on top of the world when he's leaving the palace. And in just a few seconds when he walks out the gate, in a matter of seconds, his explosive temper has switched from happy, happy, happy to a hotbed of hatred. Why? He didn't do anything. And to be honest with you, nothing happened to him. He just let the inactivity of somebody else affect his emotions. In fact, Mordecai didn't even do anything. Mordecai didn't have to do anything. Mordecai just didn't do something. And this guy, in a matter of seconds, goes from happy to hateful. I hate him. See, Queen Esther had played into his pride, didn't she? Haman was as easily manipulated as the king was. How many times in the first 4 chapters did we look at all these different people that manipulated the king to try to get their own way? Well, Haman was manipulated too. You know how Haman was manipulated? Because he manipulated the king. And he was subject to the same kind of manipulation. Mordecai offended his pride, and his pride now turned into malice. And so in verse number 9, he was reversed. And in verses 10 through 12, he's now rallying, which you'll generally see when somebody that's hateful and is reversed, they'll start rallying. They'll rally their troops. These verses are typical of a small men in large positions that have their pride wounded. Remember when we studied Haman's personality, he's the one that hadn't earned respect. He was the one that the king put in a position and then demanded respect. And so now he is demanding respect from Mordecai, who, we've studied it, for personal reasons, refuses to comply. And so Haman is the man with wounded pride, and he is rallying the troops, seeking to lick his wounds. He's gathering his allies, and he's rehearsing his own accomplishments. Which, by the way, what were his accomplishments? Benefits from the king. Haman went forth that day joyful, verse 9, with a glad heart. But Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate. He stood not up nor moved for him. He's full of indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman refrained himself. When he came home, he sent and called for his friends and Zeresh his wife. Rally the troops. That's what we do. We have our pride wounded. What do? We rally the troops. Group texts, group emails, phone calls, conference calls, Facebook, Twitter. If that doesn't work, we'll just take you to court. We'll make it public. Verse number 10, call the wife, call the friends. This is a pity party is what this is. It's a pity party. Verse number 11, Haman told them. Haman told them. You see, Haman's not calling them together to listen to advice. Haman's calling them together so he can brag and boast and lick his wounded pride. He doesn't want to listen. He wants to talk. It's about his prideful boasting. Haman told them of the glory of his riches, the multitude of his children, all the things the king promoted him, how he advanced him above the princes and the servants of the king. Yea, moreover, or Haman said, moreover, yea, Esther the queen did let no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she had prepared but myself. Tomorrow I'm inviting her also with the king. He talks about his prosperity, the glory of his riches, his posterity, the number of his children. By the way, in chapter 9, verse 10, if you've read ahead, he has 10 sons. Sons are regarded as the greatest proof of manly excellence in Persia. He can't talk about his accomplishments. All he can talk about is his kids. He talks about his prominence. All the things wherein the king has promoted him. Well, what did you do? He doesn't have anything he can talk about. All he can talk about is the king has promoted him. He talks about his preeminence. He advanced him above the princes and the servants of the king. Then verse 12, he talks about his preference. Even the queen invited me to the banquet. Just me and the king. Just us two. The queen likes me better than anybody else. In fact, the queen probably likes me as well as she does the king, because she invited him to dinner. I got to come too. She's married to him, but she probably likes me as much as she does him, because I got invited to dinner with the king, right? That's literally the suggestion here. What's more, I'm going back to another banquet. I got to go to the Queen's banquet tonight. That's why I'm home late. I've got to go to the Queen's banquet tonight. Don't expect me early tomorrow because I'm going back to another banquet tomorrow. Just me and the king. Here's the suggestion that Haman's making. I'm involved in the public affairs of the nation, and I am involved in the private affairs of the nobility. I'm a very powerful man. Don't you know it? I'm a very powerful man. You should bow down to me and do me reverence. Verse 13. We see the man repulsed. We see him repulsed. All of this availeth me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. All of this honor is useless to me because I have one more thing. All of this doesn't mean a thing as long as I've got that. That one more thing is Mordecai will bow to me. I don't care that everybody else bows. I don't care that I have favor with the king. I don't care that the queen might have a crush on me. I don't care about anything else in this empire. That man will bow to me. I will have him submit if it kills me. And by the way, if you've read the rest of this book, it will. That attitude is what kills this man. Haman has the world by the tail. But he cannot bear the slightest offense in this very small matter. It's been suggested in some commentaries that I've been using that we may observe Haman's reaction, and we can learn from Haman's reaction how to analyze our own temptations. What is it in our life that causes us to react out of proportion to the offense that's given? Whatever it is that causes us to react out of proportion to an offense is a clue that we probably have an idol in that particular area. And whatever that idol is probably being threatened. In Haman's case, the idol was his need for public recognition, and the threat to that idol was Haman wouldn't bow, Haman wouldn't stand, Haman wouldn't, or Mordecai wouldn't bow, Mordecai wouldn't move over and get out of his way. One man that just didn't like him. The second thing, whenever we feel an unusually or inordinately strong sense of achievement, an unusually strong sense of achievement might be a clue that one of our idols is being recognized. One of our idols may be venerated or puffed up. In Haman's case, before the queen, it was his idol of pride. It was his idol of recognition again that was being manipulated. It was being stroked. She was playing his idol of pride. When we think about this relationship between Haman and Mordecai, it would be better to work out our differences than to stew on them and stew on them until the pot boils over. Turn with me to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, we know generally as the Sermon on the Mount. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew records for us the teachings of Jesus. And in verse number 20, Jesus begins to teach us about hatred. And he expounds to us the sixth commandment. In verse 20, he says, I say unto you that except your righteousness exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. You've heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not kill, and whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. But I say unto you that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whosoever shall say to his brother, Rekah, shall be in danger of the council. But whosoever shall say, thou fool, shall be in danger of hell fire. Therefore, if thou bring thy gift to the altar, and there rememberest that thy brother hath aught against thee, leave there thy gift before the altar, and go thy way. First be reconciled to thy brother, and then come and offer thy gift. Agree with thine adversary quickly, while thou art in the way with him. Way means road. Whilst thou art in the way with him, lest at any time that adversary deliver thee to the judge, and the judge deliver thee to the officer, and thou be cast into the prison. You see, verse 20 here says, your righteousness is self-righteousness. Jesus is saying you're not as good as you think you are. Verse 21, I summarize it this way. Anger and malice are a violation of the 6th commandment. You see, we talk about do not kill, and we think it's wrong of us to put a gun to somebody and pull the trigger, or put a knife to somebody's throat and slice their throat and literally take their life. But Jesus says, no, no, no. He says your anger towards someone is killing them. Anger and malice is a violation of the 6th commandment. Verse 22, this is Christ's application. It's his interpretation of the 6th commandment. He says if you have anger, you'll be judged. Reka here literally means worthless, stupid, vain. He says if you think that, if you say that about your brother or sister, you'll be brought before the council. Fool, you call them a fool, you'll be in danger of hellfire. Verse 23, pretty clear. If you're not right with your brother, it's pretty impossible. You're not fit for worship. If you can't be right with your brother, you're unqualified for worship. So verse 24 and 25, go be right with your brother. While you're at it, verse 25, don't just go be right with your brother, go make peace with your adversary. And so the above doesn't just apply to those that we call brother or sister. The anger and the killing applies to those that we call enemies, adversaries. Anger in your heart will wreck your worship. So go make things right so you can be right with God. Don't pretend. Don't sweep it under the rug, because God isn't impressed and God doesn't accept your worship when you're angry with somebody without a cause. Just want to think about that for a minute. Do you know what happens? We'll go back to our text and we'll read the last verse. Because you know what happens in the last verse. We call this revenge. Retribution. Then said Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends to him, let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high. Tomorrow speak thou to the king, that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go thou in merrily with the king unto the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. And as we've said so many times before, do you recognize, can you spot bad advice when you hear it? This is another one of those times where sometimes there's good advice given in this book, and sometimes there's bad advice given in this book, and you have to know which one is which. And by the way, this is another broken one. This is another one of those broken laws. You see who gave the command here, right? This is every man should bear rule in his own house, and she's pulling the strings, isn't she? She's telling him what to do. Let me say this. This is revenge. He's already had the edict of extermination passed. He's already got the law passed that's going to kill every Jew in the Persian Empire. But he can't wait 11 months. He can't wait 11 months. He wants his vengeance, and he wants it now. And go build the gallows and build them 50 cubits, build them 75 feet tall, because I want my revenge, and I want it now, and I want it in public where everybody else can see it. You see, whenever you seek vengeance and you react in malice, you're probably not acting wisely. Especially when it's pointed towards a single individual, as Haman was doing towards Mordecai. He's already got the edict towards the entire nation, towards the entire ethnicity of the Jews. But he wants to single out the one now. See, Haman has never heard Romans 12:19. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but give place to wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. And so he gets this advice from his wife, just kill him. Just kill him. How many times in the Bible, especially the Old Testament, have we heard that advice? Just kill him. David got a wife that way, didn't he? Certainly the advice to kill Mordecai by making a grandiose spectacle of him was out of line. Warren Wiersbe describes these acts of malice this way. He says, malice is that deep-seated hatred that brings delight if our enemy suffers, and it brings pain if our enemy succeeds. Malice can never forgive. It must always take revenge. Malice has a good memory for hurts and a bad memory for kindness. 1 Corinthians 5:8, therefore, let us keep the feast not with old leaven, neither with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. And so the advice here is hang him on a pike. Hang him on a pike that's 75 feet tall. Haman's malice is not very different from malice today. Malice like yours and like mine. You see, Queen Esther had to act. Queen Esther resolved in chapter 4, and her resolve led her in chapter 5 to act. And the same thing's true of Haman's malice. It has to act. It can't be hidden. It will surface. And when it surfaces, it wants to be on display. It will express itself. And Haman here intends to make an example out of Mordecai. You know why? Well, he wants his revenge. He also wants his money. I mean, he's going to try to demoralize the Jews. I mean, look around. Mordecai was the one that was kind of out front and trying to intervene to the royal household. He's the one telling Queen Esther about this plot to kill the Jews. And because of that, the Jews are out mourning and weeping, and they're finally praying, and they're finally weeping, and they're finally repenting, as we said last week. And he wants to demoralize these Jews just in case they intend to resist. He wants to break up this mourning and fasting and weeping. And this act will get rid of the one person who has dared to resist his cronyism. It's the one person who has dared to resist his corruption in public. You see, Haman sought to manipulate the king. Oh, but it's been returned to him in kind, hasn't it? And now he knows. And he is the one now that is acting first and going to regret it later. Only he doesn't know that. That's next week. See, we said last week in chapter 4 that it was an identity crisis. It was Esther's identity crisis that concluded with her declaration that if I perish, I perish. It's a resignation that had to be. Necessity required that it be followed with an action. And it was in chapter 5. Not merely the resolve to act at some future opportunity, but it was a resolve to act now. Act decisively. Act immediately. And so what did she do? She came to the king. And that's a picture for us as well. You must not merely think about coming to the king. You must actually come to the king. And we hear a lot about God's sovereignty, and I totally believe and trust in God's sovereignty, but the other side of that is human responsibility, and you must come to the king. You must come and you must express your submission under the outstretched scepter of his righteousness. And that is a picture that Esther gives to us in quivering deference to the king. In contrast to the queen is the haughty Haman. And unfortunately, that's where many of us often see our own action, and it's our nature. It's what we're trained to do. That's what our society today tells us is the right thing to do, but that's what the Bible tells us is not right. See, we have the bull by the horns. We have the world by the tail. We're on the top of the mountain, and that's where we're trained to be. That's what the world wants us to be. But you know what? There's just one thing. You notice that there's always one more thing. Our human nature is never satisfied. There's always one more thing. There's one more dollar. There's one more danger. There's one more disagreement. There's one more something that we can never let go of. Godliness with contentment is great gain. And the context doesn't matter. And the controversy doesn't matter. And the cause doesn't matter. There's always something that we can't control. There's always something that we can't conquer. There's always something that we can't overcome. There's something that we'll have the attitude that we have to conquer it or it's going to conquer us. It's either me or it's that. Whatever that is. We just can't or we won't let it go. Mordecai had a lot of pride, didn't he? And in chapter 4, we saw his pride broken. When he recognized that his pride had endangered the Jewish people. In chapter 5, we see another man with pride. Haman. The haughty Haman. The one whose pride would not be broken. And his pride went to malice. And his malice would not be assuaged. And pride and malice go together. They work together. And they must surface. They must act. And when they do, it's never for our good. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves. Give place unto wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord. That's the contrast between Esther's meekness and Haman's pride and haughtiness. And that's the question for us today. Which one is paramount in our lives? Which one is prominent? Which one is deciding factor for us? And it can be different in different situations. You may be humble at work and proud at home. You may be humble at church and proud in the world. I pray that you're humble before the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and that you know him and you follow his leadership. Let's stand. Brother Derek, if you'll come, we'll sing a verse.
249.